From 1998 to 2006, Mexico City was terrorized by a string of heinous murders. A serial murderer was on the loose and they were targeting elderly women. The police were baffled, the public terrified, and in the end, it was the most unlikely of suspects who would be revealed as the culprit. A female professional wrestler by the name of the Lady of Silence, real name Juana Barraza, who took a bad guy persona to lengths no one could ever anticipate. It's estimated that this luchadora turned serial murderer sadistically took the lives of at least 48 little old ladies. This is the story of the little old lady killer.
Former female wrestler Juana Barraza has been sentenced to 759 years in jail.
Nicknamed the Little Old Lady Killer.
Son 759 años por el merecimiento de pena, porque lo que no sería justo es...
Juana Barraza was born on 27 December 1957 in Hidalgo, a small municipality outside Mexico City. From the very beginning, her life was marked by tragedy. The exact details of her upbringing are hazy and vary depending on who is telling them. Some say that Barraza's father abandoned her and her mother the day that she was born, taking Barraza's brothers with him, never to be seen by Barraza again. Others have reported that Barraza's mother, who was an alcoholic fornication seller, was the one who took her and left. But either way, Barraza was fatherless and with only her mother from an extremely young age. Her and her mother would eventually move to the Federal District of Mexico, where the two would struggle financially. Her mother eventually entered an abusive relationship with a man and ended up marrying him, bearing 2 more children, but slipped deeper into alcoholism as the years wore on, with Juana bearing the brunt of the abuse. Juana was verbally and physically assaulted by her mother for years, with their relationship deteriorating in a constant cycle of abuse. Her mother also exerted her control over Juana by limiting her education as well, forbidding Barraza from going to school. The reasoning behind her mother doing this is because she believed that women didn't need formal education in order to be a housewife, and she believed that Juana would follow the same path that she did. Barraza's lack of schooling led to illiteracy her whole life. The situation worsened for Juana Barraza in 1969 when she was just 12 years old, when her mother brought her along to one of her drinking excursions with her 26-year-old friend, Jose Lugo. Jose and her mother drank until she ran out of money, but being the desperate alcoholic Barraza's mother was, she offered Jose Lugo a deal. In exchange for 3 beers, he would be allowed to do whatever he wanted to her daughter Juana, despite her only being 12 years old at the time. The deal was accepted, and Lugo took Barraza to his bed, where he reportedly tied her wrists together, mercilessly beat her, and ruthlessly R-worded the 12-year-old girl. This resulted in Barraza's first pregnancy, which ended in a miscarriage soon after. The torment continued long after the initial event, as Barraza was forced to live with Lugo by her mother, because her mother could not look after her anymore because of her hedonistic lifestyle. The length of how long Barraza lived with Lugo vary, as some reports say that she lived with Lugo for anywhere from 3 months to 4 years. But one thing was for certain, the SA perpetrated by Lugo on Barraza continued throughout the time they lived together. Reports have also said that Lugo also invited some of his friends to brutally R-word Barraza, resulting in at least 1 more pregnancy, and it was unknown whom the father was of this baby. During her time with Lugo, Barraza's mother told the rest of her family that Juana had chosen to leave them to go and live with Lugo, enabling her imprisonment without outside interference. Finally, her stepfather's brothers managed to rescue Barraza and return her back home, but the damage was long since done, both to Juana as well as her relationship with her mother, as this solidified Juana's hatred and resentment for her mother that she carried for the rest of her life. The abuse perpetrated on her by Jose Lugo, as well as the years of abuse from her mother, also helped Barraza to form a mental barrier and an ability to remove her feelings and emotions from things. This is something that would be noted about her personality later in life, as she presented as shy with others, but in all actuality, she was a sociopath. Her stepfather did what he could to prevent further abuse after the Lugo incident, but the relationship between Juana and her mother remained icy until her mother's death in 1976 from cirrhosis of the liver. Barraza would eventually leave home after marrying a taxi driver, but in what would become a consistent pattern with Barraza, the relationship didn't last long, as she married, divorced, and remarried several times over the next decade, often being connected with men associated with the underground of Mexico City, including gangsters and drug dealers. During this time, Barraza also began to worship Santa Muerte. Pardon my pronunciation, but Santa Muerte was a female offshoot from Catholicism, otherwise known as the Saint of Death. Santa Muerte faced condemnation from the Catholic Church, and even though some people did worship Santa Muerte, Barraza took her worship a bit further than most, as she dedicated a shrine to Santa Muerte in her home. Barraza would bear 6 children and become a housewife, living a relatively normal, if unspectacular life until her latest husband disappeared in what was rumored to be a cartel-related act. Needing to support her family, Barraza would take a number of jobs, but her lack of education limited her options, so Barraza primarily did domestic work, including washing and ironing clothes. Juana was also known to sell popcorn outside wrestling venues, and having always had an interest in lucha libre, Barraza started to piece together that with her unusually large physique for a woman, she might be able to mimic some of what she saw wrestlers doing in the ring, and so she decided to become a wrestler. Soon after, La Dama Del Silencio was born, translated to the Lady of Silence in English. Barraza took the moniker because she felt it fit her quiet and shy nature. She donned pink and white wrestling gear with a butterfly mask, traditional for Mexican luchadors, and worked as a heel. Though never reaching the top brass within Mexico's lucha libre circuit, Barraza was able to tour the Mexican independence throughout the 1980s and 90s, earning a modest living of anywhere between 300 to 500 pesos per match, which is about 40 to 60 American dollars per match in today's money. Many of the wrestlers who worked with her during this time regarded her as having a good reputation, as she was said to have gotten along with most of the wrestlers, and it was said that she was a pretty solid worker. Life seemed stable for Barraza until a spinal injury occurred in a match, and after struggling to heal from the injury, she was forced to retire from the ring. Though her connections allowed her to stay within the industry, working as a promoter and publicist for other wrestlers, as well as returning to selling popcorn outside of the venues. With the money drying up and her family still in need, however, Barraza started to look for more desperate means to make money. Beginning in 1995, she began a string of petty thefts and burglaries, starting by stealing items from various shops and eventually breaking into homes. Barraza then learned of a new government program starting in Mexico City that offered financial benefits and medical assistance to the elderly, and saw this as a means to exploit Mexico's most vulnerable demographic. Barraza and her friend began to dress as nurses and would break into the homes of elderly people who lived alone, under the guise of being government workers sent to help them, and would rob the old women once given access to their homes. Their partnership was short-lived, however. A shift would take place in 1998, however, when Barraza's eldest son, Jose Enrique, was beaten to death following a mugging incident. Barraza would call this event the saddest moment of her life, and it would inherently change Barraza's criminality, with many experts pointing to this incident as the final straw that caused Barraza to turn her back on society. Soon after, murders of elderly women began being reported in Mexico City, and fear began to spread of a serial killer that was a man. There are multiple theories as to when Barraza's murders began. Some believe that, grief-stricken by her son's death, Barraza could be linked to some of the murders of old women that began as early as 1998, but Barraza's first officially attributed murder didn't take place until 2002, when on November 5, she came to the house of 64-year-old Maria Anaya. As was typical of Barraza's schemes, she was dressed as a nurse and claimed that she was part of a government program to help Anaya with her paperwork to get medical assistance, gaining entry into the home. Soon after, Anaya allegedly angered Barraza with a statement, causing Barraza to beat up and strangle Anaya, killing her and finally robbing the home of any valuables. When this murder occurred, the notoriety of the little old lady killer began to increase, and psychologists have hypothesized that it was the rush of potential fame that eventually spurred Barraza to continue her deadly crimes. The country of Mexico was especially horrified by these murders because of who they were targeting. The elderly were particularly respected and revered in Mexican culture, and it was believed that only a uniquely heinous individual would target society's most helpless members, as it was said that even criminals knew not to go after the elderly. Barraza would not strike again until 2003, when she was known to commit 7 more murders. She would become even bolder in the subsequent years, committing at least 30 murders between 2004 and 2005, with nearly all of them following the same pattern. Barraza would target an elderly woman aged between 60 and 90 years old who lived alone, thanks to a list that she had acquired of women who were on government assistance program. She would gain entry to their homes, either by offering to help them with something like carrying groceries, or more commonly, by gaining their trust by posing as a government worker or a nurse with a fake ID, and would then beat and strangle the woman to death, sometimes with their own stethoscope, but typically with items found in the victims' homes. She would also rob them, selling their valuables on the black market, as well as claiming some trophies and trinkets for herself, typically religious items like crosses or crucifixes. Barraza was able to go on her crime spree generally uninhibited for a few reasons. For one, she was known to run within the lucha libre circles, so it wasn't unusual for Barraza to be out at odd hours or traveling throughout different cities. But most notably, in the earlier years, the Mexican police didn't see a connection between the murders. At first, Mexican police officials tried to say that the rise of murders of elderly women since 1998 was the work of unrelated criminals, and even made various arrests to prove this fact. As the number of murders rose though, and the public outcry intensified, the police began to consider the possibility that there was a serial killer on the loose. But this created yet another problem. Mexico just didn't have a lot of experience dealing with serial killers. At this point, there were only 2 ever serial killers in Mexican history. Mysterio Canchola, a Jack the Ripper copycat in the 1960s, and the second being Sarah Aldrete, a cult follower in the 90s who murdered in the name of her cult leader. Thus began a string of missteps and misinformation that allowed Barraza to continue to roam free without a hint of suspicion. Much of Mexico's perception of serial killers came from their neighbors to the north in the United States, where charismatic serial killers like Ted Bundy were all over the headlines. Criminology reports also revealed that none of the victims had nail marks on their throat, a sign that there generally wasn't a struggle before their strangulation, which led police to believe that they were dealing with a highly educated and sophisticated killer who could lull their victims into a false sense of security before striking. It was also determined that the killer was a man, as it was believed that there was no way a woman would be strong enough to execute the strangulations. This led to one of their first arrests, a former convict named Alejandro Ovando, who had been caught attempting to assault a 63-year-old woman. Even though his fingerprints didn't match the ones found at other crime scenes, Mexican officials had insisted that they apprehended the little old lady killer. But as the murders continued to be reported, officials could no longer blame potential copycat killers, and it was clear that Ovando wasn't the culprit, so the case was reopened. In January of 2004, another murder matching the modus operandi of the little old lady killer was committed, this time on 75-year-old Margarita Quezada. Once again, Quezada was found strangled with an item from her own home, a radio cable in this case, with no sign of struggle, and her neighbor reported to the police that she was approached by someone in a white lab coat looking for retired residents living alone and claiming to work for the government. This matched what many other eyewitnesses to the murders also reported, that the culprit was wearing nurse's clothing. This led to authorities arresting Matilda Gallegos, a nurse who legitimately worked at the Institute for Social Security and Services for State Workers, because she matched the description of the murderer. After being released due to a lack of evidence, the authorities tried again in April of 2004, this time apprehending another woman who was known to enter the homes of elderly women posing as a nurse in order to rob them, Araceli Garcia. But despite Quezada's neighbor not being able to identify Garcia as the woman she saw on the day of the murder, and Garcia admitting to various thefts but vehemently denying being a murderer, Garcia was arrested regardless, and officials began touting the end of the killing spree. Once again, however, the murders continued, showing that the serial killer was still at large. What's crazy is that Garcia is still in prison to this day for the murder of Margarita Quezada, despite steadfastly maintaining her innocence, and saying that Quezada's murder was the doing of Juana Barraza. The next red herring that plagued the investigation was not a suspect, but rather a painting. The painting was Boy in a Red Waistcoat by Jean-Baptiste Grouzet. Once again, pardon my pronunciation. In 2005, 3 victims of Juana Barraza possessed a print of the French painting in their homes. The police began to wonder if there was some connection between it all. Ultimately, it proved to be another wild goose chase that got the police no closer to solving the mysterious murders. Other leads, such as murders only being executed on Tuesday and Wednesday, or killings happening in the day rather than at night, proved just as fruitless. Bernardo Batiz, the chief prosecutor of Mexico City, was becoming increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress in the case, vowing to find the killer before the end of his term. Sketches and sculptures were made of the assailant based on eyewitness reports and spread throughout the city, but even that proved convoluted, as some of the sketches turned out masculine and others feminine. Still convinced that it had to be a man committing the murders, but with all of the witnesses consistently placing the culprit in female clothing, the Mexican authorities shifted their attack. First, they reached out to the French police, who had recently dealt with a similar case with serial killer Thierry Paulin, also known as the Monster of Montmartre. Paulin was a gay drag performer who murdered upwards of 20 elderly women in France in the 1980s. This led to the authorities under the idea that the little old lady killer may be transgender, and launched a subsequent attack on the transgender fornication seller community, arresting anywhere from 80 to 100 transgender fornication sellers without probable cause. Many of those arrested were quickly released after it was shown that their fingerprints did not match the ones found at the crime scenes. Discriminatory arrests with no actual culprits put the Mexican authorities under scrutiny from the media and public. In September of 2005, things intensified further with the murder of Carmen Miguel. At the time, Barraza had begun working with an accomplice, a taxi driver named Jose Herrera, and the two made their move on the 82-year-old Miguel, beating, robbing, and then murdering her through strangulation, as became the signature move of Barraza. Whether known to Barraza or not, however, Miguel was the mother of a prominent Mexican criminologist who began to pressure law enforcement to crack down further to both protect the elderly as well as catch the killer. Because of this, the police enacted Operation Parks and Gardens, patrolling the areas where the crimes had started to become more frequent in the hopes of catching the killer in the act. The police even bribed some old women to sit unaccompanied in shaded areas and allow themselves to be bait and try and nail down the little old lady killer. But once again, none of their plans succeeded. And then everything went quiet. After the strangling of Maria Hernandez with her own scarf in October of 2005, there were no new murders for the last quarter of that year. It was the longest such stretch without a murder of an old woman since the attacks began all those years ago, and the police began to speculate that the little old lady killer may have taken their own life, bringing the case to a satisfying end, as they still had no idea who the culprit was. Barraza meanwhile continued to live her life otherwise, unhindered by her violent alter ego, still struggling financially but managing to get by. And with the police still falsely believing that the murderer had been an effeminate man, no one suspected the burly Barraza. Even when she would appear on local television as part of wrestling promotions, she still did work for and attend. In fact, as early as 2006, Barraza appeared on Aztec TV as part of an interview of her wrestling character, proclaiming that she was quote-unquote heel to the core. She was flaunting her double life in plain sight without drawing the slightest of suspicion. It's very likely that Barraza would never have been caught were it not for a series of lucky breaks for the police only 1 week later after this aired. On January 25, 2006, Barraza came across landlady Ana Alfaro and asked if she could come into her apartment for a glass of water. Upon being permitted to enter, Alfaro allegedly said something to anger Barraza. She then strangled Alfaro with a stethoscope, leaving the woman dead on her own floor before robbing the apartment. On her way out, she crossed paths with a young man. She didn't think anything of this, but that young man was a tenant of Alfaro, and upon entering the apartment, he discovered the grisly scene and immediately signaled to a police officer who happened to be passing by. After a short chase, they apprehended Juana Barraza, who they saw fleeing the scene and matching the description given by the man. Barraza was said to have began calmly eating a sandwich upon her arrest, holding an image of Santa Muerte as she did. The authorities began to search her apartment, and it became clear that Barraza was in fact the serial killer that they had been looking for all these years. She had an altar, not only to Santa Muerte but to Jesus Malverde, the patron saint of bandits and Mexican drug cartels. Despite being illiterate, Barraza had kept newspaper clippings of her various crimes, and there were dozens of trinkets and memorabilia found from the women she had murdered strewn throughout the apartment. Just for good measure, Barraza's fingerprints matched those that were found at 10 of the recent crime scenes. The police, embarrassed that they were mistakenly looking for a man for all these years and attempting to save face, had Barraza pose with their sculptures they had made of the assailant based on the eyewitness testimonies to try and save face and show that it had in fact been their diligent police work that brought the little old lady killer to justice, not just sheer dumb luck. In an interesting twist, the media's perception of the little old lady killer shifted upon Barraza's capture. What was once framed as a cunning and intelligent male serial killer, akin to those popularized in the United States, was now being presented as a deranged and pathological woman. Barraza, for her part, admitted to killing only a single woman, Alfaro, saying that she got angry because of what she said, and that it was out of a need for money. Barraza refused to admit to any of the other killings, claiming that the police were trying to pin all of the murders onto her. She also openly questioned why the police were not pursuing the group of other people who she claimed were responsible for the other murders. Criminal trials in Mexico are not done before a jury as they are in the United States, but they are held before a single judge, and this was the case for Juana Barraza when she was tried for her crimes in 2008. Her defense argued, much like Barraza upon her arrest, that she was being propped up as a scapegoat by the Mexican police and that her single murder should be thrown out on the grounds of insanity, adding that she was unfit to stand trial due to mental illness. The prosecution, however, who was charging Barraza with 11 murders, countered that the criminal psychiatrist had deemed that Barraza was of sound mind while committing the crimes, and determined her motives to be less about financial gain, but more due to a deep-seated hatred for her mother, the original little old lady. They said that she saw her victims as a way to get back at her mother for all those years of torment and abuse that she faced as a child. In the end, Barraza was found guilty on 11 counts of murders, 12 counts of robberies, and was sentenced to a then Mexican record of 759 years in prison. However, because Mexican law dictates that sentences are to be served concurrently and that no sentence may exceed 50 years, Barraza would be eligible for parole regardless in 2058 at the age of 100 years old, should she be alive at that point, which is very unlikely. Barraza would become a minor celebrity in prison due to the sensational nature of her crimes, but she refused to give interviews or be seen by the public for many years. She reportedly works as a gym instructor in prison and sells tacos on Mondays and Wednesdays to inmates to earn an income. Since her sentencing, and seeing that she had no prospect of getting out, Barraza took credit for 4 of the murders that she was accused of, claiming that she only killed them because they surprised her while she was burglarizing their homes, but she maintained her innocence for all of the rest. And so ends the tale of Juana Barraza, the professional wrestler who came to silence dozens of little old ladies. To this day, there are over 30 unresolved cases that have been attributed to the little old lady killer. Despite the case being closed in 2006, experts estimate that Barraza was responsible for 48 deaths, making her one of the most prolific serial killers in Mexican history. Her story continues to intrigue historians and filmmakers throughout the world, inspiring everything from documentaries to television series and even ballads. From a traumatizing beginning to an eventual violent crime spree, there's little doubt that Juana Barraza, the Lady of Silence, was exactly what she said she was, a heel to the core. Juana Barraza was one of the most evil wrestlers of all time, as well as the men involved in the Ring Boy scandal that was covered up by Vince McMahon. If you want to check out the Ring Boy scandal video, click the video on screen now. Thank you for watching the video.